Welcome back to The Great Conversation. Today is a fun day because we are diving into a work by Plato, Crito.
Yes.
And we're talking about the good life. We're talking about a just and righteous life, as Socrates would define it in this work, and really by his life and how he lived. And so we are in prison with Socrates, and Crito comes to visit him early in the morning and pleads with him, "Please, Socrates, the boat's coming in. You're going to be put to death tomorrow. Please escape. We will find a place for you to live, to hide, to be exiled." And Socrates goes through these series of questions to prove that he needs to stay in prison and needs to justly be put to death because that is what Athens has decided is just.
Yeah.
So it's a lot going on. I think from face value, we would side with Crito, right? We would
For
say,
sure.
okay, he went through this. He went through his trial. He justified himself. He proved that he did not need to be put to death or even really slapped on the hand or anything. Like, what did he do wrong?
Yeah.
And yet Socrates feels like the Athenians were correct and that he should follow the law, right?
Based upon the justice system, more than based upon maybe what he personally felt he was doing. And he seemed to have honored Athens more than even himself. He put Athens above himself in saying that this is a right and good result based upon the system that I believe in. Right, because we see it through the rest of his writing. Hey, I've been in government. I've served here. I've served there. So he wasn't like a bystander to Athens. He was somebody who was committed, involved. It made me think of when you complain about your country, right? Unless you're involved, to me, you really have no right to complain, because if you're involved, then you're trying to make a difference. And by his words, we were seeing that it was a system he believed in because he was present and he was a key part of the government.
Right.
That was some of my thought process.
Yeah, and he even says in this work, Socrates says, Athens is fine with people leaving. Like, if you don't like it,
Love
then
that.
leave. If you do like it, and Socrates did love it, he didn't travel abroad a lot. He was fully committed to be in Athens for his life, to have his children there, to raise his children there. And if that's the case, then he says, by default, I submit and I am under this law. And so I have to abide by it, how the system works.
Yeah.
And I cannot, if I try to change it at this point just because I feel like I have been treated wrongly, then the system is corrupt, right?
Yeah, you're undermining what you've said you've believed in the whole time. And it's like almost like the idea that it's all good and well until it happens to you. And then it's like, okay, no, there's something's wrong here. But his argument, which I love, where we get the Socratic method from, is he is not willing to argue on his own behalf. He wants to argue on the behalf of what he considers justice and truth. And that is the justice and truth of the whole of Athens and what he has been, grown up to now believe in.
Yeah. So I kind of want to back up to the beginning when Crito first comes to him and says, I am your friend, Socrates, and if you are put to death, all of these people in society are going to say, well, he had great friends. They didn't even try to do anything for him. They just let him go to prison and be put to death. And Socrates really is very blunt about the fact that why do we care about the mass? The mass, the mob, the group think or whatever, is that really who you care about? And then he likens it to a gymnast and the trainer. And you should only care about what your trainer thinks. The moment you think and care about what everybody else thinks, that's when your failure might happen. And who do you have to look to at that point? Your trainer's going to say, well, you didn't listen to me.
Yeah.
And so my question is, in life, we want to kind of turn this story more personal. What is that one person in our life that we care about and who is bettering us, instead of always thinking about what the masses are caring about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you have to consider the one person who you will spend the rest of your life with. That is the person who you ought to be shaping yourself to not comply. Like, I hate to use the word comply, but really that's kind of the best word. Like, in order for us to have a great marriage, we ought to be in compliance with one another, as in you're nurturing and valuing each other for the betterment of your marriage, for the betterment of the teamwork, but not necessarily the societal teamwork, right? Like, it's more of the you and I and our unit and what works best for our family. Do we have somebody who can be a mirror unto us? Because we often miss the faults that are so easily, we say like blind spots, right? Is there somebody who is addressing your blind spots?
Right.
Did Socrates have that person? I don't know. I mean, he was such a thinker. It seems like Crito comes to him and he's like, let me assess your blind spots, Crito. So that was kind of the interesting thing to me is Socrates seems to be somebody who has thought long and hard about everything in his life, right? And he's had hard conversations with many different people. So he's been able to sharpen his intellectual sword against a lot of different adversity.
And I think that's what Socrates was asking Crito is you care about what all these other people are going to think of you, but do you care about what I think of you? They were similar age at the time. They were great friends. And Crito comes to him and says, let's break you out. Let's take you to another land and hide you away for the rest of your life. And Socrates is saying, but all of my close friends that are going to be back in Athens, what will y'all think of me if I'm just hiding away? And the same with his children. When Crito said, don't you care about these children that you brought into this world? What about their education? Are you just going to let the world take on the responsibility to raise them and educate them? And Socrates says, so if I go into exile and I'm in this other land, what am I supposed to call my sons out of Athens? I love Athens. I want my kids to stay in Athens. I want them to get the education that they will get in Athens. I don't want to be in exile over here saying, okay, boys, come on over and I'll educate you while I'm in hiding. So Socrates did care about the opinion of a few, and they were his life friends. They were those that he valued, and he felt like valued the same things he valued. And so I think that's so important for us to value the opinion of a few.
I think we've talked a lot about that in our life, about where we live, how we do life. Let's get real. I often want to move somewhere more mountainous, maybe cooler, more temperate temperatures. But then I think about the value of the family we have around us. And that is what I value more than maybe my pleasantry comforts of weather. And I feel like a lot of decisions are made, if I were not to counsel with you, that would be more of preferences off of base foundational principles. And so for people watching, like, it's a constant pursuit of really finding what's foundational in your life and going off of the foundational things rather than the creature comforts and letting those things inform your life. I think we can so easily be wrapped up in the creature comforts because they're easy and simple and they don't require as much thought. Oh, I want to be more comfortable. Okay, let's just go be more comfortable, rather than remembering what's foundationally important in your life. And I think that is exactly what Socrates was saying. It's foundationally important to me that my children are raised and nurtured in Athens rather than coming and living with their old man who might die in a couple of years anyway.
Absolutely. And with him staying in prison and feeling like he is following the law, following the system that he believed in his whole life, and whether it truly was right or wrong, he says, I'm going to die still standing by the things that I have said my whole life, so that at the last minute, it's not like, okay, Socrates clearly didn't believe in everything that he taught us through his life because now he's running away from it. And
so his life's work was verified by his final testimony.
Absolutely. Okay. And so that is the good life, right? Is that if we can get all the way to the end and say we have still lived a just and righteous life, all the way till through the hard, through the great, through the bad, whatever it is, that we finish well. Socrates said this in this work. What of doing evil for evil? Do we justify one person and then all of a sudden everything else is not justified anymore? And so this act of, we have to ask the question, do the laws speak truly? And that is what Socrates said we have to ask. So whether it is truly our country and the laws that are in our country, or like we're more talking here just in interpersonal relationships, the laws, the foundation, the things that your relationship is built on, the person that you value and you're looking to verify or question whatever you're doing, do they speak truly? So in our marriage, when something comes up and one of us is wrong, and we have to try that person and ask questions and really look and say, okay, do the laws speak truly? Am I really calling you out on a good foundation? Then that can lead to more conversation and actually working through things. And that's where we said, okay, we either quit the marriage like, we go into exile, like Socrates can just go into
Yes.
exile, just quit the system, say,
Yeah.
forget about it. Everything
Yeah.
I said my whole life, I don't really believe in.
Yeah.
Or we can stay
Yeah.
and really work through it.
That was one of my questions.
Okay, go
Do
for
we
it.
have the liberty to leave marriage?
Yeah, and I think that's something that we personally believe that in our circumstance of just a discussion happening and we don't like something, then no, we don't have that liberty. Of course, there are circumstances where that's a whole nother discussion to be had, and I don't think I have authority on that. But
Yeah.
in our circumstance of, okay, I didn't like something you did, and this is hard and we're working through something, no, we are here to say, we're going to stay and work through this.
Okay. Let's play devil's advocate. If we did have that liberty, what loss would we endure? It's compound interest, right? It's the years and years of trust and understanding and verification that you've built up. So you can look back after 20 years of marriage off of all these wins, losses, ups and downs, and know exactly who you're with. So whether that be for good or for bad, as they say in marriage, for rich or for poor, you know who you're with. And I feel like that is one of the greatest motivations to a marriage staying strong, is that compound interest and a life well lived together, so you can do more together. If you think about it, if you exit a marriage and re-enter a marriage, you have to start all over with that whole equation. You don't know if somebody does something, if they're necessarily wronging you or being mean to you, but you would know that situation based on a longer marriage, right? And so like Socrates was saying, he's had all these years in Athens to prove that he believes in the system there. That's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, and I think it's a great parallel of being committed to your state and being committed to your marriage. So if we're thinking about being committed to something, because I think that's a huge takeaway from this work, is he was committed. Socrates was committed unto death. He was committed to his state unto death, and he was committed to his life and what he believed, that he did not do wrong. And so he gave his apologetics and the previous work that we talked about, and he stood by them. And yet those two things resided together inside of him. And so we would think, how is there not more of a fight inside of him of, I believe in the systems of Athens, but Athens is against me, and I believe in what I said so strongly that I'm not going to essentially like dissent from it. Like I believe that I did no wrong, and yet he still submitted to Athens, that he should be put to death. And he said a line that summed up, said that Athens says you need to either obey us or you need to convince us that we're wrong. And he apparently did not do well enough to convince them. And so then he went on to say that he has to think of justice first so that he may be happy and be justified. And so I think in our own lives, do we constantly put justice in front of our mind so that we get to win, that we get to live happy, holy, if I might add a word there, and justified lives? And I think so much of the time we feel shame or convicted, or we just don't know what we feel. We feel turmoil.
Feel wronged.
Yeah, so we're maybe the victim of so many different circumstances because we don't think of justice first. And I know that justice is a word that is really being used today. It's thrown around, I think, in a way that possibly could not be used correctly. I think that sometimes we use the word justice a little bit too much, and what we're really thinking is
fairness,
revenge.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a big thing to say, and I'm not saying that everyone is thinking that. I'm saying that sometimes I think that it could be a cover-up for maybe something in our heart that is uncomfortable with another person or a situation or an idea that's out there. And we have this hate in our heart, and yet we're saying we need justice for this situation. And maybe what we're saying is we're going to get revenge.
Okay, I love this. This is something I've been thinking about really just since we were first married. There was a lot of situations where I felt slighted. We talked about this, how you were quickly to point out my flaws and helping to try and improve me. It's just one of your convictions. You love to improve people. But then when I would point out something in you, you would get very angry with me.
It was hard. It was very hard.
Yes. And so I would feel slighted. I would feel kind of banished, so to speak. But then when I realized, I read a quote from Tim Keller's book, and he said, if living the life of Christ is extending forgiveness, extending forgiveness, extending forgiveness, if it never comes back to you. That is a Christ-centered marriage. That is a marriage that is laying your life down for your spouse. And so when I started to do that, I was acting out of justice, right? I was not acting out of revenge. I was acting out of justice, that no matter how I was attacked, so to speak, however I felt, I knew that the just way forward was to forgive. I knew that the just way forward was to point out something that I felt you need corrected. If I get a bad response, I've done my part to try and correct. I was kind in it, but I had to lay myself down. What happened throughout the years is you started to become convicted of your quote unquote behavior and how you responded to me. And so rather than picking a fight with you, sticking my ground and saying, no, I'm not going to be exiled like Socrates. Socrates explained himself. And when the jury did not find him worthy of living, he said, okay. And that was years in our marriage. And so that what happened was the way forward for us was conversation, right? Not revenge, not backbiting, not being angry at each other. And this is kind of what I see with Socrates is he's like, okay, we had the conversation, I give up. And that might be a journey for somebody in a marriage for a while as you're patiently waiting. But you know what I mean? Like that's what I'm seeing in
would
this.
you really use the word that Socrates gave up?
No, not give up. I'm saying, I wouldn't. Thank you for calling me out on that word. I would say he submitted to justice, to the justice of the system and said, okay, I gave my best, but I'm seen as doing wrong here.
So do you think that it was because you were able to critique in a positive way of something that I needed improvement on?
Yeah.
And then while I came back and was angry at you that you would criticize me.
Yeah.
Even though, yes, I would do it to you, but I could dish it, but I couldn't take it.
Yeah.
Do you think because you decided, okay, the thought process that needs to be the last thought is that I did not attack her. And now
Yes.
no longer the fight is the focus of her mind because we can only be thinking about, we can't multitask in our head. We can really only be thinking about one thing at a time.
Yeah.
And so do you think it was that I was no longer dwelling on the fight? Now I'm dwelling on my throwing out the last word as an attack. Now I have to live with that. And that is what has softened me?
I think so. Like I think like honestly, patience, right? I learned every time you responded and were upset, I learned, okay, when I use this word, that was a trigger word. When I used this word, she was more responsive. When I addressed her 4 hours later rather than in the moment. So you often get an opportunity to learn as a spouse as well, where if you're always just pulling out your boxing gloves and getting in a fight, you never actually learn how to have a conversation, which is what we're doing here, right? This is the great conversation. We're learning about each other right now. We're learning what each other values and reading this work. And so I feel like the great conversation in a marriage with a business partner, whatever it might be, if you have the mindset of conversation, then you're not fighting, you're assessing, you're focusing, right? Fighting, you're raising your serotonin levels, you're getting like your back, your hair on your neck stands up, you're not thinking through a conversation, you're acting out of rage and frustration. So that's really what I think helped me the most, was taking more of a humble approach to that situation, knowing that in the end you wanted to be critiqued, you wanted to grow, but we were just learning how to do it, or I was learning how to do it with you.
So back to, I love what you said about how justice for us is actually forgiveness. It's that humility. How do people in all relationships, obviously marriage is something that is a relationship that's in front of our face every single day. So we like to bring things back to the marriage table because we're living this every day.
Yeah.
But other people that maybe their marriage isn't where they need to grow in a relationship. Maybe it is someone that wronged them or is continuing to wrong them in a different way. I think that there's so many people that think that forgiveness and humility is weak.
It's like pacifism.
It's passive, and that's why these problems keep growing. So why do we feel like that weakness is the reason that we're being trampled on rather than the answer?
So I think I know what you're saying. Let me try and answer this with an example from today. Our son is very strong-willed. He's a firecracker. He's got some will behind him. And what happens with me is I let him do something. I let him do something, I let him do something. And then it's just like we're at like 10,000 feet. And then I'm mad, right? I'm no longer addressing the behavior. I'm addressing that he took it too far and I'm not okay with it now. And now I'm responding out of more of an aggressive standpoint rather than a corrective standpoint, right? And so if you enter a interpersonal relationship when you're down here, when it's just more of an annoyance or something that's just
The behavior
was wrong, rather than getting so fired because we're now at 10,000 feet and the only reaction you know is like, what are you doing? And you just get mad, right? So I think something you've helped me with is, hey, correct the behavior when it starts and you're okay and you're balanced and you're addressing in kindness, in knowing that that's a behavior that long-term won't serve our son well, rather than addressing it when it's just annoying you, right? And so I think for people in general, how to not be passive, and then angry, be assertive. I think that's my answer. So assertiveness in kindness over passivity that turns into rage. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I don't like to be assertive.
Yeah.
I can be, but a lot of times I don't even want to enter into certain relationships or certain circumstances in relationships because I know that there might have to be confrontation or assertiveness, and I don't want to have to deal with that. So then a lot of times I just don't enter into that circumstance or that relationship. So how do people learn to be assertive, that we don't just stuff? I mean, we have a whole episode in marriage about not stuffing, and then one day you just wake up and you're like, I want to leave this marriage because I've stuffed all these feelings all these years. So how do we as people learn to be assertive and confront things when people have done us wrong, and in kindness, like that forgiveness that's not just passive forgiveness? It's like actually going to that person and saying, you did this to me and I feel like it was wrong, but I forgive you, but I would ask that you would not do it again.
Yeah.
That's uncomfortable. How do we do that?
Practice. I think like practice in the smaller things, you know, like, I mean, maybe you have a pet lizard and you're like, dude, I wish you wouldn't go to the bathroom in the cage so much. And I'm being funny, but like, what are those smaller things that you can practice on? What are those things? What are those relationships or areas that you are comfortable with, right? And then work up to the areas that you're uncomfortable with. I think that's probably the best thing to do. You know, I didn't want to confront you a lot at the beginning of our marriage. Now I don't have much problem confronting you anymore, you know, and so it's
Must have been a really scary person.
it's practice, right? Like, I mean, that's the example we come back to, but yeah, I think it's practice. And I think there's some people that you're more afraid to offend than others. And that says more about them than it does about you. And the question is, do you care about that relationship for the long term or the short term? If you care about it for the short term, then just ignore it because it's going to blow up and you're not going to have the relationship anymore. But if you care about that relationship for the long term, then you should address it.
So then why do we care so much about, I mean, this goes back to why do we care about what the mass
I was
thinks?
just about to say that. Yeah.
I mean, Socrates is like, stop thinking about it. You don't care about them. They have nothing to do with you. They pour into your life in no way.
Yeah.
So why do you care?
I think because in some way we feel like it's verifying some part of our life that we feel is inadequate. Somehow mass verification feels easier and feels more valuable than singular verification. And so it's like if 100,000 people say soccer is the best sport and 10,000 people say baseball is the best sport, well then as a person who values what a lot of people say, you're gonna be like, oh yeah, I like soccer too. I don't like soccer. I love baseball. Baseball is my favorite sport. Most 90% of people I talk to don't like baseball, but I still love baseball. I will watch it all the time if I get a chance. It's awesome to me. And so that applies to interpersonal relations. You know, we care about what a lot of people think about a certain thing. You know, we were having this conversation with somebody the other day and they were saying, hey, this institution says we should boycott this institution. Rather than being like, hey, what do I believe about that? How do I feel about institution B compared to what institution A thinks about it? I should think about it for myself, not think about it based on a mass level. And I think it's also somewhat lazy to just care about what the masses think rather than focusing on deep relationships and valuing deep relationships because that takes a lot more work. And so it's more vulnerable to be in deep relationships than it is to be in, you know, a wide range of shallow relationships. Which is why we continue to feel destitute in valuable relationships because we've spent so many times in so many thin relationships. And so all those thin relationships we feel like should add up to the feeling of a good, deep relationship, but it doesn't. And I think that's one of the biggest things is we've spent so much time out of practice of conversations that we no longer know how to address a wrong that's been done to us because we've never practiced it.
I kind of want to comment on what you said about all of these shallow relationships we feel like need to add up to a deep relationship.
We hope.
Or we hope.
Or we think.
We think. Okay. Did I get it verbatim?
Yeah, kind of.
And it makes me, again, go back to this idea of we're going to force this group of people to like us when it's not in the nature of it to happen that way.
Yeah.
But then we have this one deep relationship, a spouse, and we don't really care.
You don't value it? Is
we
that what
don't
you're saying?
value what they think of me, or did I measure up? And I know that in a relationship we might think, well, you don't need to measure up to your spouse, but I do think when there is deep respect for one another, I thought about this morning, that I value your opinion so much that when I am grumpy or angry about something, or if I'm just not acting in a way that I know is the right way to act, I think about what you think, because you are just this kind of happy-go-lucky, life's great, don't be grumpy, be thankful for what we have. Yeah. And so when I act poorly, I think, what does Ben think of this? And I think that that's important in a relationship. That's that accountability to get better. And if we really respect what the other person thinks, there might not even have to be as many confrontations and as many moments of let me critique you, let me make you better, because you're kind of already thinking, how would they want me to act in a good
That's
way?
So good. Yeah.
Because I want to meet the mark. I want us to be pushing each other to get better.
Yeah.
And I think there's so many relationships that maybe that's not, maybe you just don't even think about that. And you're not trying to disrespect your spouse or not care. You just don't think of, you know what, if I did this, what would my spouse think? I think that
Why do you think people don't think of that? Why do you think people don't value their spouse?
Because I think that we just, in relationships that are kind of there all the time, we forget about it.
We forget about what? The value of it?
The value of the relationship, that they're just there. They're there every morning when I wake up until maybe one day they're not. And so I do think every day we have to think, am I measuring up in a good way to what my spouse thinks about life or values or wants to see in me?
Think about it this way. If Athens went away tomorrow, would Socrates be sad? Whether he's about to go to jail, whether he's about to be killed or not, absolutely. Imagine the remnants in his mind of thinking, wow, my children will never be able to be raised in the system that I love, in the education system that I love. And we often don't think about that about our spouse. I think about that. But I know a lot of people don't. I'll tell people this. I'll say, I think about my children and my wife dying every day. Every day I think about that they could die today. And that makes me sad. And it makes me immediately grateful for no matter what kind of day we had. Sometimes I'll get upset, of course, in the moment. But then I go back to that. Like, what if they were gone today or tomorrow? Then I would have spent my last moments frustrated about nothing. And I feel like that is how it seems that Socrates lived most of his life. He didn't live his life for, whatever uncertain future. He lived his life for the present and what he valued. And I just feel like that if more people live that way, they would value their spouses more. Because there's so many things that your spouse does that are great. And those few things that are annoying, you should work on them together.
And I do think calling them out and saying, I want to work on this with you. I don't really like it. And if you're open to it, let's try to change this.
Yeah.
I was always told, don't ever go into marriage thinking you're going to change your spouse.
Do you agree with that?
I think that if you hate something in the person you're dating, absolutely not. You should not think, okay, well, one day they'll stop doing it.
So you're saying you do agree with that?
Can I finish?
Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah.
I used to be told that you should never go into marriage thinking I'm going to change my spouse.
Okay.
And I think that if it's things that you're like, I absolutely hate this about the person that I'm dating. I don't like their family, but one day I'll get them to leave their family. Or I don't like the way that they are always going to the gym and working out and trying to stay fit and eat healthy, but we'll change all that. Or maybe the other way, they always eat junk food, whatever.
Yeah.
But I do think that in marriage, we should be changing. And it's going to happen naturally anyways. We change as people every day. And so I do think having the mindset of, I am helping my spouse change and they're helping me change, but we're doing it together and we're both open to it. I think that is a very healthy thing to happen in marriage. And it's going to happen, so we might as well feel a little bit more in control of what's happening because we are going to change. And the question is one day when we wake up, are we going to change so much that we're different? Because I hear a lot of people say, they're just not the person that I married. Well, no, we're always changing. You're never going to stay with someone that stays the same as when you got married. But the question is, are you changing together and for the better?
Yeah, that's what I was about to say.
And I think this does go back to, like we started the episode, Socrates said the good life was a just and righteous life. And I think we all have to ask ourselves, are we living with that in our minds, in our marriage, in a relationship, in the way that we're treating our citizenship, whatever it is? I think that justice and righteousness should be heavily on our mind.
Yeah, and I feel like what we came to, which was the idea that forgiveness is entwined with justice. Because in order for Socrates to, I love the line when Crito came in, he said, I've been here a while. And he says, what do you mean? And Crito goes, I've been staring at you. He's like, you just look so peaceful. And it was the idea that I feel like in that moment, Socrates had forgiven the system for the situation because he felt he was doing an okay thing, but he had to forgive the system to be able to sleep in peace, And
I do think when we bring justice to maybe what it truly is, which no one is just, right? None of us do it exactly right.
Yeah.
And yet there does have to be justice. So how does that happen? Where does that justice actually come from? And I think that goes back to an episode of what is our foundation? Who is deciding what is just and what is not just? Because as I said, that word is heavily our culture is saturated. That word is just everywhere. And yet, do we really all agree on what justice is? Because I feel like we kind of all have a different idea of what it is. And if we can't agree on the foundation and what that justice is, then we're not going to get anywhere.
I love what you said, kind of switching gears back to marriage for a second. I love what you said about that you almost start correcting yourself in your marriage when and when you've spent time talking with the person, what the person wants to see in your marriage together. Like there's so many times I'm like, wow, I didn't say that thoughtfully, because that's my struggle. I'm just kind of a whippersnapper. I say things randomly. I'm kind of goofy. And then I say something, I'm like, wow, that didn't really sound intelligent. That didn't sound like the husband that I know Annabelle would love me to be. And so you start to kind of critique yourself, which doesn't even align with my last comment, but I was just thinking about it. And I feel like that's such a good way to live, is always remembering, hey, what does my spouse want out of me in a positive way? And if I can meet her there, you can meet him there, then that's a better team. We don't have to then argue. We don't have to critique one another if we're already critiquing ourselves in a positive way to try and better ourselves for the greater good of our marriage.
I think that's so true. I love the way that you put that, because I didn't even put it in that words of, as you enter into a marriage and you kind of want to change a few things, you want to improve your spouse. And if you really talk about it and you both have standards and you both are trying to better yourselves, then that natural critiquing of the other person does become more inward of, okay, I know what my spouse values. I have loved them and known them long enough that this is clearly how they want to live. And instead of him always critiquing me, how about I just critique myself and try to get better in that way? And I'm using the word critique in a very positive way. I think that we always hear a critic, you're such a critic, but critiquing can be so good.
Yeah.
And that is what betters us.
Often I'll ask you, hey, I've been working on this. Have you noticed? Sometimes you say no. And then I feel kind of crappy, but at least like you can say, at least I can then say, hey, and then he goes, oh, okay, he's been working on it. And then maybe you'll look out for it more. Maybe I'll be like, okay, then why have you not noticed that? That happened a few weeks ago. You're like, no, I really haven't noticed. And I'm like, why? I did this, I did this, I did this, I did this. Did that not make an impression? And you were like, no, but maybe if you did this, this, and this. I'm like, all right, cool. Like now I've got a game plan. And so, a lot of times you can be like going along, feeling like you're making a difference and not getting that feedback loop. Just ask, right? Maybe you're doing the wrong things and the feedback loop isn't coming because the thing you're doing doesn't matter. And so that's another big part of it too, in marriage at least, or in friendships.
And always being open to, okay, I've been trying really hard and I'm even going to tell my spouse that I've been trying and not having the mindset of they are going to give me what I want to hear. Because then what can happen is, well, now I'm not even going to try anymore because I did all of this and you didn't even notice and it wasn't right. Yeah. And so being open to like, okay, I'm going to be vulnerable. I'm going to be open. I'm going to be humble here. Hey, I did this. You didn't notice. why didn't you notice? And then when he or she says, well, maybe try this, not being like, well, I'm not going to try that because that's not what I want to do. Being like, okay, I'm already open to trying to make this better.
Yeah.
And that's great. Thank you for that feedback. Let's try that. Because the thing is, I think that we're always so open to being hurt and we like want to be hurt instead of being like, okay, this is a conversation. I clearly wasn't doing it right because we're both humans and we don't do everything right. Yeah. And we're working together. This is teamwork. So why are we getting hurt about it? Why are we all of a sudden becoming each other's enemies by choice?
Well, we played team sports, right? Wasn't that supposed to help? It's going back to a previous episode.
That's true. And noticing that we are both on the same team. Yeah. So why are we fighting about it?
Yeah. I think because sometimes one person feels like they're a better team player, right? They almost want to prove that they are better at playing marriage than the other person.
And I think this comes back to value. If we have to value ourselves, because if we don't, then we are always looking for that verification. And, this gets into different love languages. And I understand that some people need words of affirmation. And so if I'm not giving and I'm terrible at giving it and I've had to work.
You're working on it.
Yes. You're doing great at this episode.
Thank you.
Do we value ourselves? Do we feel like we are pushing ourselves to become better in a way that, okay, if I get some critique, that's okay because I still have so much value. I still know where my value comes from. I feel like I'm getting better at life. I feel like I'm pushing myself. I feel like my spouse is pushing me. And together, we're not in a competition, but we've got some healthy stamina going on to make ourselves better. But I do think that this idea of like, I feel devalued. I feel like I don't measure up. I don't know where my value comes from. And then if we get criticized or if we feel like our spouse is doing life better and they're just so much happier and they're succeeding and I'm just at home just being a mom and nobody's recognizing me, then it's like, okay, I have to find my value so that I'm anchored in that so that when criticism comes up or if my spouse is really achieving something and they're just like doing so great that I don't feel smaller, that I just feel like, okay, I can encourage the person in that and together we're going to get better. We both win.
One thing I was going to ask is, so when you critique me, you're not saying you don't value me, right?
Right.
That is something that often one can feel. I have felt that. If you critique this, that means everything I've done today sucked.
I think it goes both ways. I think that the person might feel like they're not valued. And then I think that sometimes even the conversation is the person critiquing, do they feel valuable or are they trying to make the other person feel smaller by criticizing them?
So then they can feel bigger.
Yeah, and I think that those circumstances both can happen. I know in our specific situation, I just have this desire to like, I'm very detailed. I see things. I want things like perfect. And I'm like, hey, Ben, I love you so much. You could even do better at this. And I do not do a good job of pointing it out in that tone and with those encouraging words. A lot of times it's just like, plain speech, Ben, you do this, it bothers me, or it's not making you look any better or look more confident, stop doing it.
Yeah.
And that's where I need to improve, is the way that I present something.
There we go. So the presentation can often merit the feeling of the receiver, right? So if you really think I'm awesome, it's the whole like sandwich, right? Compliment, critique, compliment, right? Like that's actually like the compliment sandwich. It's a good idea because then you can at least verify that you do appreciate the person, you do value something in them. Give them a little bit of a pat on the butt and then value them again, right? In the beginning of Crito, the work, Crito is coming to him and he starts to kind of insult Socrates. Like he's saying like, you're going to be looked at as a bad dad and like all this stuff. And I was like, bro, you could have done that like a little kinder. But maybe that was their relationship, right? Maybe they were like very forward with each other. But I just thought it was very interesting. I thought it was a very harsh way to address Socrates. Luckily, Socrates was a very like open person. So he kind of came back at him and, dished it back. So you have to kind of know the relationship you're in. Is it one you can come at very forward or is it one you have to kind of come in with the compliment sandwich?
So I think that we can sum up this episode saying that we have to find the person in our life that we value their opinion. And really always coming back to grounding ourselves in our actions. How do they make that person think about us? What do they think about us? Yeah. And from there, really grounding ourselves in how we act. Is it something that is just? Is it something that is righteous? Do we really stay committed to what we originally said we were committed to? Of course, if we reevaluate and say, okay, I committed to that and that's really corrupt system or that the marriage is just not working right, that's a corrupt marriage or whatever. In those situations, of course, like, you have to evaluate the system. But in our circumstance, our marriage is clearly something that we both value, and we're staying committed to that. The relationships that we have in our lives, we're kind of evaluating those all the time and saying, is this making us a better person? Should we continue to be with these people and hang out with these people, etc.? And from there, when we are grounding ourselves in that justice and that righteousness, that life that we are saying, this is a good life, we should then see a result of happiness and joy and flourishing in our life, right?
Yes, though I will say that this life is not have a bend towards happiness all the time. This life does have a bend towards brokenness, hurt, pain. There's a lot of that in the world. And so if we expect that our life is to be a life of sunshine and rainbows, we'll be severely disappointed and we'll think something went wrong. So I think you need to find somebody who you find brings, whether you're unmarried, if you're unmarried, you got to find somebody who brings you that light. You got to brings you that happiness, some of that along with them. But realize that in that marriage, you will find brokenness, you will find pain, because it's just natural in life.
Because we're all broken.
We're all broken. And so don't expect a marriage to fix you. Don't expect a relationship to fix you. Expect it to be something of like a sharpening substance, like I always think of like flint, like, you can spark it and it's going to ignite something great. But in order to get that spark, you got to have that contact, right? It's that contact that creates the spark. So there's going to be some complexity. You can't expect happiness out of every moment. And so I feel like that's one of the things where people get let down in a relationship or in a marriage and then they give up, where you have to see that and think, oh, there's that resistance. There's that contact.
I knew that was coming.
Now what am I going to do with it? Exactly. So that's probably one of the biggest things that I see in young people. When I say young people, I'm fairly young, but 10 years our junior, is they expect a relationship to be a solving of their issues rather than a exasperation of their issues, because until you can heal something, it may be exasperated, right? Because somebody's going to rub up against you and it's going to create some friction.
It's going to be that squeeze and what comes out.
Exactly. And so I feel like you're saying, I agree with, but I also argue a little bit against, because though our marriage is better than when we first got married, it did not come just because we moseyed along and it just happened to unfold into something better. There was a lot of abrasion that we used for the flourishing of our marriage.
I would bring it back to the work, though, that Socrates is in prison saying these things about happiness.
Yes.
And yet he is in a situation that I don't know if a lot of us find ourselves in prison, about to be executed.
Saying, this is all right and well.
Yeah. And so I do think if we feel like we are standing by something that we are like, this is right, this is just, this is where I should be, right next to you, that even when the hard times come, I'm still going to feel happy.
Yes.
In a sense, not the sense of the word that we use today of just everything is easy and pleasant, but I am happy because I am in this with you and I believe in this.
Yeah. I think peace and conviction would be a feeling that you would resonate with in a hard time, more than happiness and maybe like elation.
All right. So thank you so much for joining the great conversation. I hope you enjoyed everything that we talked about. We were really open about things, and we honestly just want to build a life that is amazing, and we want you all to do the same. So I hope this is something that's adding a piece to your puzzle. Yep. Next week, we're going to talk about the word clouds. So make sure you join us. We'll see you in the next conversation.
Yes.